Welcome, everyone. My name is Ting Ting Cheng. I'm the director of the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA project at the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia Law School. The ERA project is a law and policy think tank established this year in January to develop academically rigorous research, policy papers, and expert guidance, and strategic thought leadership on the Equal Rights Amendment to the US Constitution, and on the role of the ERA in advancing the larger cause of gender justice. I'm proud to present an advanced screening of My Name Is Pauli Murray, a documentary feature brought to you by the directors of RBG about the pioneer, lawyer, activist, poet, Episcopal priest, and unsung hero of the civil rights movement, Pauli Murray. As you'll see, Thurgood Marshall and RBG stood on Pauli's intellectual shoulders, and we're all indebted to Pauli's contributions to our civil rights landscape. After the screening, we'll be joined by Betsy West, one of the incredible film directors, for a live Q&A starting at around 7 p.m. Eastern. We'll post in the chat right now the link and a password to be able to screen the film on your device. Okay, and with that, we'll individually press play. Let's time it around 5:35, so we'll do it around now so that we're all in sync. So we'll individually press play on our own devices and we'll reconvene around 7. Enjoy. Okay, welcome back, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, Betsy. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm great. So I'll kick things off and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay. Is everyone seeing me now? Is it like an auditorium or is it all virtual here?
It's all virtual.
Okay. Okay.
That's the format
that
we're working with right now, and so everybody out there, we have a really good participant list. Please post your questions in the Q&A box.
Cool.
Right. So it is my pleasure to introduce one of the directors of My Name Is Pauli Murray, Betsy West. Betsy is an Academy Award nominated director and producer of RBG. She's a 21-time Emmy Award winner for her work as an ABC News producer and executive producer of the documentary series Turning Point. So Betsy, one of my questions is, where do you keep all of these Emmys?
I have a few of them up there with little hats on them, but part of them is like when you work collaboratively, as I did at ABC News for many years, they are the product of many people's work. So
yeah, I just see you opening like a kitchen cabinet and it falling on you. And also your accolades don't stop there. As vice president of CBS News from 1998 to 2005. She oversaw 60 Minutes and 48 Hours. She was executive producer of the Makers documentary and digital series, the short documentary, The 4% Film's Gender Problem, and the feature documentary, The Lavender Scare. She's a graduate of Brown University and the Fred W. Friendly Professor Emerita at Columbia Journalism School. So Betsy, welcome back to Columbia. It is such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Virtually. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for making this film. I want to start by echoing Dr. Brittany Cooper's opening question, which is, how is it that somebody who's so pivotal existed, yet we don't know their name? I want to start by asking you, Betsy, how did this film come to be made?
Yeah, as you saw in the film, Ruth Bader Ginsburg gives credit to Pauli Murray for coming up with the idea of using the 14th Amendment to secure gender equality, having that idea in the mid-60s when it was pretty radical. So we learned about that. Julie and I learned about that in the course of making RBG, but it wasn't until after the film was over that we did a little research, like, who is this person? And then we were completely blown away, to put it mildly, by the vast array of accomplishments, especially contributions to civil rights, Thurgood Marshall, the early activism, the sort of ahead of the curve on every single level that you could imagine. And yeah, that's what we said to ourselves. First of all, why didn't we get taught about Pauli Murray in our high school civics class or in college. And, wouldn't it be interesting to see if we could do a documentary?
Yeah, I wish that the first time I watched this documentary, I could have had somebody to text with to feel like, what? She did this? What? It's just so extraordinary. So speaking about Pauli's gender non-binary identity, I want to start off by just asking you about how, Pauli existed at a time when a language and the culture governing these non-binary, queer, fluid identities didn't exist. And the film was really careful to include these different perspectives and to situate that in a historical context. So how do you understand her gender nonconformity in today's context, and how did that inform the making of the film? And I sort of go back and forth. I try to say Pauli as often as possible, and then I find myself saying she, like the professors.
Yeah, I say Pauli, I say they, I say she. I mean, it's hard. Look, when we went into this, there had already been some scholarship about the fact that Pauli's private letters, none of Pauli's public writings, but the private letters in the voluminous archive at Harvard contained material indicating that Pauli had a strong feeling that Pauli was a man, and it was searching for some kind of help from doctors, help which was completely unavailable. And so we knew that would be a part of this story, but frankly, as a white cisgendered woman, I don't think I fully, and I think Julie would agree with me, and that I didn't totally understand the impact of this. And as we got into the material and saw the pain and the private struggle that Pauli had at a time when there, as you said, no language, no community, no one to help. And it really struck us that it was important to relate Pauli's situation to today's. And so that's really later on in the film when we began to interview some LGBTQ activists, people who had deeply studied Pauli and been affected by Pauli, see Pauli as a beacon for the queer community in many ways, and to get their thoughts about this tricky issue of pronouns, because some people do refer to Pauli as they and feel that's honoring Pauli, and some people feel we don't know how Pauli, who was a pretty opinionated, prickly person, what Pauli would think about this. And so that's why I do try to call Pauli Pauli, because we know that's a name that Pauli actively chose instead of Anna Pauline. But so I sure learned a lot in the course of doing this film, and we tried as much as possible to make it from Pauli's point of view and to include voices of people who either knew Pauli or had deeply been affected by Pauli.
And Pauli's personal struggle with gender identity wasn't only limited to the kind of personal realm and the personal pain. It also shaped Pauli's like political and legal insights. And that just speaks to Pauli's like incomparable resilience and indomitable spirit. Like, when I watched the film, I kept on asking myself, like, what does it take for somebody to live their authentic life? Yeah. Especially for somebody who experienced, imposter syndrome at Hunter and, and was living at the intersection of all these different experiences. I mean, can you just talk about just how, uniquely brilliant, how just so resilient and strong she was, and also human at the same time, that mixture of all of those things.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it was Rosalind Rosenberg's biography of Pauli that first brought up this idea, or at least for us, that it was Pauli's in-betweenness, in between gender, in between race, in between in many areas, that informed Pauli's innovative thinking. And recognizing that so many of the boundaries that people take for granted are arbitrary and meaningless, whether or not they're gender-based boundaries or racial boundaries. And so you can definitely say that, Pauli's personal fight for identity and thinking about identity did impact Pauli's brilliance in not accepting the status quo, not accepting what everybody else was saying. The idea that Pauli in 1943 is coming up with the proposal that Plessy v. Ferguson is wrong. It's going to be overturned. There's absolutely no way that you can have separate and equal, because by the very nature of separateness, that makes it unequal. And at the time, you have to sort of place yourself in Pauli's time, which is what we tried to do in the film. A lot of the NAACP lawyers at that time were fighting for more equal. Okay, separate but equal is the law of the land. We just need to get the equal part right. Better schools, better this, whatever. And it was Pauli's idea that psychologically and in every way, that's impossible. We have to go at the heart of this. At the time, Pauli was ridiculed, and yet 10 years later, that's part of the argument that Thurgood Marshall used in Brown v. Board of Education. So clearly, Pauli was a brilliant legal mind. And you ask yourself, where did that come from? Where did that ability to challenge the status quo come from? And I think it is related to Pauli's identity and the struggles to live an authentic life.
Mm-hmm. And then I want to talk about, her coming up with the concept of Jane Crow.
Yeah.
Right. And it's sort of that being the intersectional sort of personification of intersectional existence for Pauli, mixed race, mixed gender, mixed class, all of these different kind of backgrounds. And then also, Pauli's gender activism was really radicalized at Howard Law School. Can you talk a little bit more about how, at a place where her race was irrelevant, but her gender was such a huge barrier to everything else, how crazy that was for her?
Yeah, Pauli goes to Howard with the idea of becoming a civil rights lawyer, of fighting the injustice that Pauli has seen. And yet in the first week of being there, Pauli saw that there was a legal society forming for men. Come and join our legal society. And Pauli asked a professor, well, why can't I join this? And he said, well, start your own for women. Only there were no other women there. It's crazy. So, that was just one instance of the disrespect and the kind of condescension. Why do women want to be lawyers anyway? And ignoring the hand in the air, really, for the first year, according to Pauli. And then when Pauli's grades came out, things changed, and the professors there recognized that here was an outstanding student. And so, Pauli gained respect that way. But I think it was shocking to her. I think, Jane Crow is a concept that Pauli developed before anyone, mentioned intersectionality, and intersectionality is a wonderful idea. And, Kim Crenshaw's contribution to social justice movements, it's a huge thing. But if you look at Jane Crow, it's a similar thought that Pauli had as she was coming up against, gender discrimination, even in a place that was supposed to be fighting for equality, Howard Law School.
Yeah, and again, to situate sort of that time, in the 40s, Howard Law School was very kind of an intellectual place that was very pro-male, pro-Black, and so that phrase to me speaks not only to just kind of like a one-dimensional form of feminism, it's also just like a critique of, gender disciplinary that comes out of the Black community in the 40s at a place like Howard, but then also speaks to her understanding of like overlapping forms of oppression. So just these insights that were way beyond what
Yeah.
everybody else is talking about, and
Yeah.
being alone in that, kind of this
Yeah.
lone wolf.
I know. I mean, I loved Eleanor Holmes Norton saying, you know, we were perplexed. Like, what's she talking about? We're fighting for civil rights. Nobody's thinking about, you know, no one's a feminist in 1963, except for
Pauli Murray.
I know.
That was so incredible. So talking about her sort of Pauli's true independent spirit and being this principal and coming from treated like this matriarchy, like highly educated aunt who raised her and who really instilled in Pauli this idea of like, be your authentic self and, you know, don't compromise. And her practice of this thing, confrontation by typewriter, which I think is really amazing, makes me want to like go and buy a typewriter. But, you know, Pauli was often ahead of the times, and she also seemed to be somebody who was kind of a lone wolf, you know, who wasn't really attached to like broader social movements or was just so far ahead, right? Can you talk about and you talk about this in the film, but maybe elaborate on the, you know, the risks of being such a lone wolf principled person like Pauli was?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that Pauli was I mean, Pauli rubbed elbows with some incredibly powerful, important people in the 20th century. Let's face it, you know, friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, you know, colleague of Thurgood Marshall, and, you know, RBG and on and on. And yet Pauli wasn't really a joiner, really, and didn't always stick around to get credit for the things that Pauli did. If you, you know, if you look at Pauli's life, was always moving on to the next challenge, to the next thing. I mean, when Pauli had this pretty lucrative, cushy job at Paul Weiss after, you know, a couple decades of real poverty, and then just out of principle, becoming so disgusted with the ongoing violence in the South, and a young man being lynched in 1959, and Pauli wanting to explore the independence movements of the countries, newly independent countries in Africa. I mean, Pauli just was so adventuresome and was always looking for the next thing. And I think that that also may be because perhaps there was an underlying unease that people had with Pauli's queerness. You know, Pauli did sometimes present in a more masculine way, not always, but sometimes. And there may have been, in Pauli's mind, a real danger in revealing true identity. And you think about the lavender scare in the 1950s, people were fired willy-nilly for being homosexual, for being suspected of being homosexual. I mean, it was not something like, oh, my parents won't like it or something. It was a true and present danger for many people to reveal who they were. And so Pauli may have recoiled a little bit from being so public. You know, I'm not sure we'll ever exactly know that. I mean, but that's a little bit of the sense that I get.
So interesting. With Pauli, we also get this clarity, this authenticity, this focus on principles, right? And I think that it's deeply inspiring in today's polarizing politics. You know, I think we learn a lot from Pauli when thinking about crafting, let's say, like a civil rights strategy that's proactive and not reactive. What do you think Pauli would have made of sort of our times today?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I feel, you know, it's a big responsibility to speculate about that. I mean, I think one of the things that Pauli was about was seeing connections among various groups. Pauli saw that the labor movement was connected to the civil rights movement, was connected to the women's movement, and at their heart, all of them were about human rights. And I think toward the end of Pauli's life, turning towards spirituality, Pauli talked a lot about reconciliation and bringing people together. So I think that would be part of Pauli's message, for people to see that they do have a common interest and that they should work together to try to get to a goal, which is, of course, easier said than done. But I do think that's one of the things that informed Pauli's thinking.
Thank you. So I'm going to open it up to the Q&A. Let's see. Marianne would like to know more about Pauli's marriage in the film. She said, I don't recall hearing any mention of the marriage. Did you choose not to mention it, and why?
There wasn't a marriage. Yeah, Pauli had a very deep relationship with Irene Barlow, Renee Barlow, whom she met at Paul Weiss. But, and this from the letters between Pauli and Renee, you can tell it was like a marriage. You know, they relied on each other, they comforted each other, they helped each other, and they were playful and funny. And, you know, it feels like a marriage, but they were never married and they didn't live together publicly. And when Renee died, Pauli, it was so painful for Pauli because not only had Pauli's partner died, but the rest of the world didn't really know what it meant to Pauli. You know, maybe some people did, some people had a sense of it, but it wasn't something that was acknowledged.
And then there was a kind of short-lived marriage to somebody when she was a college student.
Oh, yes, there was a
for
marriage.
Like a second, right?
It was look, there are many aspects of Pauli's story that we couldn't cover. And there was a very short marriage, which basically resulted in a disastrous weekend together and then the end of the marriage. I mean, it was, you know, I don't quite know what prompted Pauli to marry this person, but it was such a blip in Pauli's life that's why we didn't mention it. I mean, there are many things we didn't mention in the film. I mean, we feel you have to make choices in a 90-minute documentary. You can't tell everything. And, you know, that was one of the things that we just decided was just not that meaningful to Pauli. You know, perhaps convinced her more that that's not, you know, where her identity lay.
It seems that with this documentary feature, it's almost just like the tip of the iceberg, because Pauli was so prolific and there's just so much to discover about their contribution.
Yeah.
I'm mindful of the time. I want to ask you one last question, which is, what can we do to keep the memory, spirit, and contributions of Pauli alive? I mean, we'll certainly spread the word about watching this amazing documentary. Are there other resources for people? You know, this is something that the ERA project can work on as well, so you can give us some homework too.
Yeah, I mean, we feel like, look, but scholars, gender scholars and African-American scholars and others have been writing about Pauli for a while. It's not like we discovered Pauli Murray. I mean, there are books out there and experts to read, you know, Jane Crow and Patricia Bell Scott's wonderful book about Pauli's and the First Lady, the Firebrand and the First Lady, and Pauli's books themselves. The early family memoir, Proud Shoes, which is kind of, Pauli thought of it as a precursor to Roots in a way. When Roots came out, Pauli was like, hey, I wrote about that in the 1950s. And similarly, the poetry just kind of blew us away. Dark Testament, I mean, it's just beautiful, beautiful poems. And I hope, and I see now, you know, go into bookstores and I see Pauli Murray's books there. I'm so happy. You know, I think that this documentary is part of a reconsideration of our history. First of all, why Pauli Murray's been left out of the telling. And, you know, I think in a broader sense, it's not just Pauli Murray's story that we haven't learned. And we're looking back and trying to, you know, uncover the truth about what happened in our country and the important people who played a big role. And I hope, that's what I hope, is that just people are going to go out and learn more about Pauli.
Great. So I'll close by a quote that I love by Pauli. In not a single one of these little campaigns, I was victorious. In other words, in each case, I personally failed, but I've lived to see the thesis upon which I was operating vindicated. And what I very often say is that I've lived to see my lost causes found.
Yeah.
Pauli's work in building the architecture of constitutional gender equality in the 14th Amendment is not only foundational, but the reason why the ERA project exists today as we build the modern equality movement and work to add explicit sex equality finally in the US Constitution. So I want to thank you, Betsy, for making this film, for telling Pauli's story, and for giving us all cause to say Pauli's name and celebrate Pauli's life. We are so grateful. And thank you to everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much. The name of Pauli's book, Dark Testament, it's been reissued. I see that question there. And thank you for correcting me on the marriage, because there was a marriage, but it's one that was just so small. It's like people talk about a starter marriage. This wasn't even a starter marriage. This was like... Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.